not talk much about him because we have very less time before the lunch. Mr. Raghubir Bose, who is a renowned author, of course, also. And he's a senior consultant and an enterprise architect with TCS. He's a thought leader, he's an author, he's an innovator. He's an IT leader with 25 plus years of experience. He has worked as a consultant, as an architect, as a strategist, as a developer with TCS for many years and with many Fortune 500 companies. He's currently focusing on how an organization can achieve enterprise agility. And currently he's also heading the DevOps COE for TCS BFSL. Recently he has co-authored a book on DevOps which is titled Assessing DevOps, a Definitive Guide to Assess DevOps Quantitatively for Your IT. And his topic for today's discussion is Evolution of Enterprise Architecture, DigitalOps and ArchOps. A very interesting topic, but of course, let's all sit back. Let's take the knowledge from him, and then we will definitely break for lunch. Over to you, Mr. Bose.
So just pre-lunch, getting hungry, and a bit of quick memories. I presented in DevOps Summit 2018. I think, ma'am, it was in Leela, right?
Yes.
Right, and Marriott. So the crowd was different, and I think John and all came in. It was and that particular summit, we published our book. The book is like 5 years old now. It is it's something that we look at when we do consulting. But today we want to speak about something very interesting. Yeah. See, we have been talking about DevOps a lot. DevOps is seen as an engineering faculty. But there is a stream of guys who call themselves as architects, who live in a space of abstraction. How do they look at DevOps? And how even the statements like DevOps is slowly dying, SRE is maturing. What's the new mix in the crowd? Many years back, when DevOps started, there was a topic called Agile infrastructure. It was such non-interesting topic that the guy who proposed the topic didn't even showed up in the session. And the guy who came into the presentation coined the terms DevOps. His name was Patrick Dubois. I don't know how many of you know the story. So this is a similar story. Now, our friends in McKinsey, they have a statement to make. They say that your architecture is not really doing good with respect to DevOps principles. It's pretty much waterfall, the architecture process itself. So what we are talking about is how can we bring in DevOps practices in an architecture world. It's a different thing. We are not talking engineering here. We are talking architecture. How many of you understand the difference between engineering and architecture? Any hands? Yes. You suddenly don't start doing engineering, right? You cannot. And we are talking architecture, and we are saying architecture is not needed. I'll just start doing DevOps. I'll start doing engineering. Nobody does that. You look at, I was expecting Dr. Mohammed to be here. I don't want to do AWS. I don't want to do Google. I first want to know what I want to do. That's my architecture question. So the first part is, if you look at the old world of architecture, it's very, very waterfallish. It still happens. I work for banks. I work with many, many architects in the banks. Almost all of them are waterfallish till today. I am bringing in a topic. Go back to your company. Discuss. Are architects agile people? Are architects having DevOps principles embedded into it? The answer is a big no. This is what Gartner is saying right now. Go to the enterprise architecture report hype cycle of Gartner. You will find that they are saying that enterprise architecture is a very, very important discipline. And it has to take in DevOps principles. And that is exactly what we talk about the modern world of DigitalOps or ArchOps. Very simply put, your observability, your SRE, your pipeline architecture, everything comes later. First is how you're planning to even architect. So the important things that you need to understand is how are you going to take care of the DevOps principle from an architecture lens. That means we are talking about Agile architecture. How many of you are aware of this principle of Agile architecture? Architecture itself is Agile, meaning I am doing an architecture in a way so that my engineering is an in-sprint activity. So I'm talking about in-sprint architecture. Things is not that simple as it sounds like. You go to an architecture group and ask them, can you do Agile architecture? Can you do architecture with DevOps principles? He'll say, oh, I don't know that. DevOps is an engineering stuff. That's the new thing that's in place. So what are the important part that comes into the place? When you're talking about, say, digital transformation, what's the first hit? You're talking about a merger and acquisition. A company buying in another company. Both of the companies are following DevOps principles. Both of the companies are following, SRE principles. One company buys over another. Say, for example, an investment company buys over another investment company. Investment bank buys over another. So both of these banks have IT systems. How do you merge them into one system? You cannot use DevOps principles for that. You have to use architecture principles. And that to enterprise architecture principles. And that enterprise architecture principle has to be Agile, because you cannot say to your management that, okay, I will do a big bang on architecture. That's not possible in modern world. That's the new idea, or that's a new paradigm that is coming in. This is called as ArchOps or DigitalOps, where your architecture meets DevOps. As of now, this is not in place. All the DevOps guys only talk engineering. Maximum they would talk about engineering with some flavor of architecture, like Dr. Mahapatra talked about well-formed architectures. But he will not talk about generalized enterprise architecture with business, data, application, technology architectures, which is typically there in Zachman and TOGAF. If you look at Zachman, if you look at TOGAF and ask them what are they doing with respect to DevOps, the answer is yes, they are going for DigitalOps. And that is exactly what is coming in a modern world. The question becomes, what are the key dimensions? Lot of terms. Some of them are being discussed here. Market ops, sales ops, FinOps, content ops, star ops, and stuff like that. So there is a certain steps that comes into the space. And these are some of the steps. For example, how do you manage innovation? How do you manage innovation in an agile way? I'm not talking how do you do engineering. How do you manage the different architecture views in an agile way? How do you ensure that what you are doing on engineering is reflecting back to your architecture views? What is architecture debt? We talk about technology debt. We talk about technical debt. But what's architecture debt? Architecture debt arrives from at least 4 areas: business architecture debt, data architecture debt, application architecture debt, and technology architecture, something that you talk about all the time. Technology architecture and technical architecture. Technical debt. Technical debt is related to code. Technology is a choice of technology. But what about business? How are we even measuring that debt? That's a big area. So all this leads to something called as hyperautomation. You should go to my LinkedIn site and read an article which I wrote almost like 4 or 5 years back. It's called Lights Out DevOps. I mean, some people spoke about it today. Lights Out DevOps is something like there is no human being and it does in an automated way. Some examples are there, but Today, we want to talk more about how hyper-automation comes in. So you have a certain simple automation that is working. Say, for example, you do a pipeline, it's all very simple automation. You do RPA, you do conversational UX, you do AI, they are all simple. What becomes hyper-automation is you define an architecture and the architecture itself becomes generative enough to take care of the rest. That means you are talking about something called as generative architecture leading to hyper-automation. And what is hyper-automation at the end of the day? Hyper-automation means that your speed of change will be more in terms of how you are defining your architecture. That means you don't actually need engineering facility. That will be auto-generated. And that's exactly what's going to happen in the next maybe 5 years. It will be a reality where you don't need so much of engineer doing SRE. You don't need so much of engineer doing DevOps. It will be an automation by itself. All you need to do is define an architecture in the right place. So you are automating architecture. This is hyper-automation, gentlemen. That's the new vision. So if you're looking in 2009, when somebody was talking about agile infrastructure, people said it's not possible. They thought, and it was so uninteresting, people didn't even attend that session because they thought that agile infrastructure, 2009, impossible. It is impossible to achieve. 2014, Samuel Hykes comes in Google and talks about Docker. World change. Last year, this year, I think in the beginning, we started talking about hyper-automation. So we expect in the next few years, what would happen is you will define an architecture and have some capabilities around it to hyper-automate to the target state. That means all your platforms will be automatically created, all your SRE, activities, SLIs and SLOs will be automatically done, your pipelines will be automatically created using your generative AI capabilities. How many of you have actually used ChatGPT for doing software architecture and design and development? Only one hand. That means you guys are not even aware of the powers of generative AI or generative architecture or LLM-based software development. Papers are getting written on a daily basis on this. So question is, how are we prepared? How are we ready? Are we at all taking this idea of automation in architecture itself rather than automating the engineering? Think about it. Typical toolkit for DigitalOps. These are some of the capabilities. That means you're talking about a toolbox. It's a toolbox for an engineer, not an engineer. Forget about engineering. It's a toolbox of architecture. With this, you can do pretty much, how many of you have seen the film called Matrix? The main character of Matrix, if you look at from a technology standpoint, is an architect. He makes a mistake, the world changes from a blue and a red pill. So same here. We are now bringing in DevOps in an architecture space. It's not an engineering world anymore. It's an architecture world. I'm again and again saying this. So bring your architecture hat and start reading this. All that you have heard by Dr. Mahapatra or the other gentleman who spoke gets embedded here. Because the discipline is architecture, discipline is not engineering. Let's be very clear on this. So it's an advanced integration of a couple of disciplines: AI, automation, analytics, and a bunch of others. Hyper-automation should be taking over the entire business and IT alignment assessment. For example, there are a lot of business challenges that goes on. How much does it take? It can take typically 8 weeks, 10 weeks maximum to begin with the way we do in our world. How many, your question is, in what time frame will they start doing that? You can start seeing that from next year, maximum. I am already seeing this with some of the large US companies. They're talking about it, big time. I don't see any US guys here, unfortunately. I'm missing John. I'm missing Mark over here. They are all people who generally talks on all these things, very, very brash in terms of what they speak, not in terms of the way we generally do. So I would request you to go to Gartner, read about hyperautomation, talk with me offline if you need some materials on how to do assessment for hyperautomation. It is not automation, neither it is automation for automation. It is hyperautomation, which is you are automating a complete architecture. That means you are automating architecture review, architecture governance, architecture definition, architecture assessment. On all dimensions. There are 7 dimensions. Business architecture, data architecture, application architecture, technology architecture, cloud architecture, DevOps architecture, and information security architecture. You heard all of it in some form and shape from other speakers. But now integrate it. Think engineering is an automation by itself. You don't need people. You need architects only. Once that hyper-automation comes into picture, I mean, if you fly an aeroplane, as an example, it's basically 2 pilots, and rest is all machines, right? That's it.